This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 726 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's Sleeper Show results were pretty good. Ryan Tannehill is my favorite streamer, and he was decent, even though it didn't look pretty. I love DJ Chark, and he had a great game. Evan Ingram had a career day. Hunter Henry was a fine streamer. Chigakonkwo was great. Chuba Hubbard was a top 10 running back. And Nick Westbrook-Akine and Van Jefferson both found the end zone. Now, the other quarterback streamers outside of Tannehill, they weren't very good. Neither was Travis Homer. So there were a few misses on the show last week, but I'm definitely happy with the results overall. Week 15 is a big week. Let's keep it rolling. Before getting to the sleepers this week, I want to remind you that the Week 15 NFL Sunday Million is officially live on FanDuel. Showcase your NFL knowledge and construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap, then follow along using FanDuel's live scoring feature to compete for your share of $1.1 million in cash prizes, including a cool $200,000 first place prize, all for just $5. Sunday's approaching quickly, so head to FanDuel and submit your lineups today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. This first tier of sleepers consists of players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And I actually like some of the sleepers this week. That's not always the case. One of those guys that I like is Mike White. White faces off against a Lions team this week that ranks as the best opponent for quarterbacks and adjusted fantasy points allowed. The Jets have an implied team total right now over on FanDuel Sportsbook that's a respectable 22 points. And we've seen White come through with good fantasy performances in his 2+ matchups so far this year. So he's my top quarterback streamer this week. I think he's a low-end QB1. Now, if you're not able to get Mike White, I think Matt Ryan might be in play. I say might because I'd rather not have to rely on Matt Ryan in the fantasy playoffs. But you can't deny this matchup. The Vikings secondary has been brutal. They've allowed a QB1 performance in 8 of their last 9 games. And the lowest ranking player during this stretch was Taylor Heineke. He was the QB 15 back in week 9 with about 14 fantasy points. Now, Matt Ryan has not been aggressive at all this year for Indianapolis. He's thrown it 15 or more air yards on fewer than 8% of his attempts. That's the lowest in the league. So I'm concerned the Colts may not be able to take advantage of this matchup. But the matchup is there. And Indy actually has a higher implied team total this week than the Jets do. So don't sleep on Matt Ryan. Now, moving on to running back, let's go to a player I talked about not just last week, but also on the 15 transaction show, and that's Chuba Hubbard. Thanks to the Panthers staying in games over their last 2, they've been able to do what they want to do offensively, which is run the ball. Hubbard is averaging a 39% running back rush share per game over his last 2 games. That's not amazing, but he's seen 31 carries. That's really strong. And this past week, he had a 15% target share. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Panthers are 2.5-point home favorites against the Steelers. Pittsburgh's not a bad opponent for running backs, but the fact that Carolina could keep this close, or even win this game, means that we could see a lot of Deontay Foreman and Chuba Hubbard. Another team that could go with a run-heavy approach this week is San Francisco. Not only do they have their third-string quarterback under center, but they're facing a Seattle team that's been gashed on the ground this year. Seattle ranks 5th in running back rushing yards allowed, and they've allowed the most adjusted fantasy points to the position. Now, I'm not sitting here saying go play Christian McCaffrey. He's clearly not a sleeper. But Jordan Mason, he is. He's seen running back rush shares of 31% and 44% over the 49ers' last 2. San Francisco's a 3.5-point favorite. And Deebo Samuel's sidelined. That could open up more backfield work for Jordan Mason. So I wouldn't be surprised if he has a decent performance. And then the last running back in this tier, or running backs I should say, are the Patriot running backs, Kevin Harris and Pierre Strong. Ramondre Stevenson and Damian Harris are both iffy for this weekend. And if they can't go, the Patriots are going to rely on Strong and Harris once again, like they did against Arizona. Against the Cardinals, Harris was the one who saw more work on the ground, but Strong saw more work through the air. And I'm more intrigued by the receiving work considering Ramondre Stevenson has seen huge target shares over the last month and a half in this offense. You've been playing Ramondre Stevenson in fantasy football because of what he's doing as a receiver. It's a super valuable role. Vegas, their opponent, they also rank 8th in adjusted target share allowed to the running back position this year. So because of all that, I like Pierre Strong more than Kevin Harris this week. But Harris is in play too if the other running backs can't go. Vegas is a top 5 matchup for running backs in adjusted points allowed. Now at wide receiver, I think you can look back to the Colts. Specifically, I want to talk about Alec Pierce. Pierce is intriguing because he's the one who's seeing targets down the field in this offense. He has 16 targets on 15 plus air yard throws this year. That's 10 more than any other Indianapolis Colt. He also drew a 23% target share the last time we saw Indy. The Vikings are also very bad against perimeter wide receivers. We attacked this exact same matchup last week with DJ Chark. Not only have they seen the most passing yards allowed to the outside, but they rank 3rd highest in percentage of wide receiver targets that go to the perimeter. That's where Alec Pierce lines up. So if you want a high upside player off the waiver wire, Pierce is probably that dude. If Corey Davis doesn't go this week, which is very, very possible, then I really like Elijah Moore. He not only played as the number 2 wideout this past week, but he'll get looks out of the slot against the Lions in week 15. And no team has given up more receiving yards to slot wide receivers than Detroit this season. It took us a while for us to get here, but it could finally be Elijah Moore season. And then how about Jahan Dotson? We saw the Commanders and Giants face off 2 weeks ago, and in that game, Dotson caught 5 of 9 targets for 54 yards and a touchdown. He saw a career and season high 22.5% target share. And he most importantly saw an uptick in snap share, playing 79% of Washington's offensive snaps. The matchup is average on paper, but Dotson is trending up, so he works. At tight end in this tier, you can look at Hunter Henry against the Raiders. In week 14, Henry ran almost twice as many routes as Jonnu Smith. His target share was just shy of 10%, which is nothing to write home about, but he's seen a 13% target share in 3 of his last 5. Vegas is a pretty average matchup overall, but with injuries to New England pass catchers, both Devontae Parker and Ramondre Stevenson, Henry could see more looks in this game. Now, Juwan Johnson could be back this week, and we've seen him with spiked target shares throughout the season. We've also seen him find the end zone 5 times. Now he gets Atlanta, a team ranking as the 6th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. So keep an eye on him to make sure he's able to go. If he does go, I think he works. Now we're on to players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues who you could consider starting this week. And we'll begin with another quarterback streamer, Andy Dalton. There's a lot of risk with Andy Dalton because of Taysom Hill, but the matchup is at least there this week. Atlanta's a top 10 matchup for quarterbacks, and New Orleans actually has the 9th best implied team total on this week's slate. Strictly when looking at matchup and projected score, Dalton makes sense, but I like someone like Matt Ryan more this week. Dameon Pierce is going to be sidelined this week. That leaves the Texans' backfield to Rex Burkhead and Dare Ogunbowale. My guess is that Burkhead takes on more work on the ground. He'll likely be the goal line back too, but I'm more concerned about the pass catching in this one, because Houston's a 14-point home underdog to the Chiefs. That means a negative game script could be coming, and the Chiefs have allowed the 6th highest adjusted target share to running backs in all of football this year. And it seems reasonable to expect Ogunbowale to be the pass catcher for Houston. Burkhead's run more routes than Ogunbowale according to Pro Football Focus across the entire season this year. But over the team's last 3, the more recent sample, Ogunbowale has seen 30 routes, Burkhead has seen 13. And if they use Burkhead more on early downs, they may want to keep him a little bit more fresh. So I'm anticipating a decent receiving day for Dare Ogunbowale if this game script goes the way that we think that it will. And then also on Houston is Chris Moore. Moore's coming off a monster day for the Texans where he saw 46% target share without Nico Collins and Brandon Cooks. Cooks seems doubtful for this weekend, and Nico Collins may not be able to go too. So that would leave Moore as one of Houston's starting wide receivers in a likely negative game script against a secondary that's allowed the 7th most adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers this year. So yes, please, he's a good sleeper. Nelson Aguilar is another player to watch this week. Devontae Parker is dealing with a head injury that was sustained on Monday night, and in that game, Aguilar ran the most routes for New England, and he saw 10 targets. That was twice as many targets as any other Patriot. He had a 31% target share. Now the Patriots get the Raiders. It's not only a fun revenge game for Aguilar, but the Raiders are a top half matchup for wide receivers and adjusted fantasy points allowed. And then one more wide receiver for you in this group, Rashid Shaheed. The last time we saw the Saints, Shaheed ran just 2 fewer routes than Chris Olave. He tied Jarvis Landry. He saw 4 targets, he caught 4 of them for 75 yards. He's a big play threat, and Atlanta ranks in the top 5 in 15-plus air yard attempt rate, meaning they see targets down the field against them quite a bit. You're banking on a big play from Shaheed more than likely, but that could happen in this spot. At tight end, there's Cade Otton. In Week 14, Otton ran 9 more routes than Cameron Brate. He scored 7 and 15 PPR points over his last 2, and Tampa Bay could be forced into a pass-heavy script against Cincinnati this week. So if you're in a pinch, you could lean on Otton. And then lastly, I'm getting a ton of questions about Jeff Driskel, so I'll just talk about him here. I do think if you can put Driskel in your tight end spot, like if you're playing on Yahoo, he makes some sense. He scored 9 fantasy points last week on just 6 pass attempts. The Texans used him to run the ball 7 times. My issue with Driskel is that obviously we're going to see Davis Mills take some snaps as well. So that's one problem. We also don't have a very large sample size here. And then we also have no idea what's going to happen in a super negative game script. Remember, Houston kept it close with Dallas last week. That very easily might not be the case this week against Kansas City. And if they're using Davis Mills through the air, if they're using Davis Mills' arm more than Jeff Driskel's, it would seem logical that they would use him in comeback mode. That they would lean on Davis Mills if they're down by a lot of points, as opposed to Jeff Driskel. So basically, there's a lot up in the air. If you have a solid option like someone like David Njoku, I'd be going in that direction at tight end. If you're throwing a dart anyway, then sure, you can ride with Driskel. It's at least a fun story for your grandkids one day. Now, there are a lot of defensive streamers this week, so I'll try to get through them quickly. First up, Washington. They're facing the Giants, and according to FanDuel Sportsbook, they're 4.5-point home favorites with a 40.5-point over-under. That's a good line for a defense. And Washington's been really good in fantasy over the last month and a half. They have multiple number 1 overall weekly finishes, and they've been a top 15 defense in each of their last 6. So they're a good play. Arizona works this week as well against a Denver offense that could be without Russell Wilson. Cleveland works for reasons I talked about in the 15 transactions episode. I currently don't know who's going to start at quarterback for Baltimore, but they have a really low implied team total. And even though I don't mind the Colts offense this week, they're still one of the best matchups by adjusted fantasy points allowed, so Minnesota and that defense is in play. And then don't forget about Carolina against Pittsburgh. The Steelers may have to go to Mitch Trubisky, but even if Kenny Pickett plays, it's still a good matchup for a home favorite. So you got Washington, Arizona, Cleveland, Minnesota, and Carolina. There's a lot of defensive streamers this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.